Hey folks, I'm Chuck Black. We're doing 52 weeks of Python in 10-minute sessions. Today's topic is tuples. Tuple is basically a list that can never be changed. So let's learn about it. Okay, so let's talk about tuples. First thing though, I want to mention this code right here, L14 tuples, is going to take 2 weeks. The first portion, we're going to talk tuples in general. And then what we're going to do is we're going to talk about named tuples, which take a little bit longer, hence the fact that we'll be doing a second lesson on that topic. So let's talk about tuples. So what is a tuple? A tuple is a list that can never be changed. This could be the shortest lesson ever, but I do have some code to show you, so bear with me. What I said is fundamentally correct. The difference between a tuple and a list is that a list, things can be appended to and removed from, but with a tuple, once it has been created, it can never be changed. In our parlance, when we were talking about how everything is an object, and we talked about things being mutable, meaning it can be changed, versus immutable, meaning it can never be changed, that means that tuples are immutable. They can never be changed. You reference items within a tuple in the same way that you do with items in a list. There will be a subscript that will be a number, and that will reference the particular item in that tuple. So let's look at some of the code. So let's look at some code that does tuples, that deals with tuples. Remember our friend create devices. It goes in, this is in create utils. It goes in and it creates this created devices, which is a list. It proceeds to go through and create the subnets and the specific indexes of the devices, creates a device, and then it appends that device to my created devices list, and it returns that list called created devices. And what do I do in my code here? I call it once. This is actually different than the long form version. I made it a little bit better, at least I think so. And so here I'm returning a list, so I get devices list. What if I didn't want a list? What if I wanted a tuple? Well, this is exactly the same as what you saw right up above, but I'm going to call this function, this built-in function called tuple, and I'm going to pass in this function call to create devices. It's going to return a list. Python is going to create a tuple out of that list, and now I have a devices tuple. And so I have this devices list and devices tuple that let's look at it and see what the data actually looks like when we do this. Now I'm going to run it, and what you will notice, I only want you to notice a couple things. Number one, look at my created list. What do you notice? What's that outermost character? The outermost character is square brackets. That's an indication that it is a list. What about when it is a tuple? Well, it's going to be a parentheses, open and close, round brackets, or parentheses, whatever you want to call it. That's an indication that it is actually going to be a tuple rather than a list. Now, don't worry about the data here. Remember, I called created devices multiple times here, and so the data is actually going to be different, the name and OS and vendor, etc. Now, you astute folks will probably have noticed that if I wanted to, I could have just done this, and instead of calling create devices again, just did something like that and called tuple on devices list. What that will do is it'll create an object that's entirely new, that's going to be a collection called devices tuple, and then if I print them out, let's look at the output and scroll back up to the top. Here we see, of course, this is my list. This is my tuple, and as you can see, the actual data is the same because I created a tuple out of the list, and so maybe that's the way I should have done it. But now you've seen both ways to do this, but you can see how easy it is to create a tuple. Now here's a simple way I can define a tuple. This is going to be data that represents a device. Notice I use the round brackets, also known as parentheses, and each of these is a particular piece of data. I happen to know, because I wrote this code, that the first thing here is the name. This thing is going to be the vendor. This is going to be my model. This is going to be my OS, and this is going to be my IP address. If I then want to reference it in order to print it out, then I need to use the subscript appropriately. So the first item is item 0. So device 0, device 1, device 2, device 3, device 4. And you may say to yourself, that doesn't seem like a really safe and good way to do things. I've got to remember that 0 is the name and 1 is the vendor. And if I happen to get some of these in the middle mixed up, then I'll be printing it out and I won't know any better. And the answer to that is you're absolutely correct. That is one of the issues with regular tuples as it is with lists. That's why we have these things called named tuples, which we're going to talk about in the next session. But that is how you can deal with tuples. It's exactly the same as if this had been a list. Now I threw this in here. This also is not in the long form version, and I decided, what if you wanted to iterate through your tuple? Can you do that? Because as you know, we've iterated through lists many times. Would I be able to do that? And the answer is yes, I definitely can do that. And if I want to do it via subscript, I can do it the way that I showed you. Here I'm creating something that is a tuple called item, and it's going to have these strings which mimic what you see here: name, vendor, model, etc. And then I'm going to have a for loop where I'm going through basically the index of my tuple, and I'm going to say for I in range 0 to the length of device, so device is the thing I defined, I'm going to print it out, and I'm printing it out in the manner that we've done with our dictionary before, but I had to kind of manually create this thing. So here's this printing. This is my device as a tuple here. This is my device as a tuple formatted with a for loop, and that's this thing you can see right here. It's very much the same. I didn't have to use these ugly subscripts, but I did have to kind of create an ugly range and reference the index as I went through it. So this is my listing of the device values within it in the tuple that is represented by the device. Okay, I just added another for loop because we have a little bit of time. This code down here is exactly the same as this code up here, except for the way that I enumerate through my device items. And what I do, instead of going for I in range, yada yada, what I'm doing is I'm iterating through device, because device is iterable. A tuple is iterable, so I can do a normal for loop. But remember, I think I've shown you enumerate before. What you get with enumerate is you get not only the actual item itself, but you get the index of that particular item. So my index is I. So the first time through here, the first thing will be name, which is the item 0, and device item is going to be the value of name, which is going to be this thing right here. And as you can see, this is my output. If I've done it correctly, it should look exactly the same as the output up here. So my name and the value of the name, my vendor is Cisco. So look over this, make sure you understand it, and let me know if you have any questions, but I thought that would be good to add here at the end. Okay, what did we talk about? We talked about tuples, which are exactly like lists, except you cannot change them. They're easy to create from lists if you so choose. You can also define them. The round brackets that you see here are an indication that something is actually a tuple. You reference them using subscripts like this. You can iterate through them in a couple of different ways that we went over. Hopefully that makes sense about tuples. Remember, they're immutable. That means they cannot be changed. If you have questions, let me know. Thanks for listening.